We are in chapter 4, entitled The Artificial Conscience. If you haven't been tracking since chapter 2, you might be confused. But chapter 3 explains how the US Constitution was brilliantly written to impose a sort of ethical conscience onto the new government. And chapter 4 is basically about how the conscience has failed. And I want to note here, especially since I can't remember if I said it anywhere else, but I think that for an individual person, we understand that our conscience can prevent us from a lot of harm if we allow it to inform our behaviors and decisions, if we follow our higher selves, if we follow our conscience, if we follow that pull of the transcendent. But I think we also understand that the more we ignore that pull of the transcendent, the more we succumb to our lower selves, the more often we ignore the conscience, the easier it becomes to ignore the conscience, to succumb to our lower selves, to ignore the pull of that transcendent. It is the same with government. The protections were built in because the founders understood human nature, that we are not inherently good. However, just as with a human conscience, my conscience, your conscience, the more the government ignores its conscience and seeks to get around all the painful deliberation, the struggle of existence, the easier it becomes to ignore the conscience, and the better they get at it. And so that's why we find ourselves where we are today, with the US government that's turned our republic into a democracy, has sought to nationalize everything, and plays party politics instead of engaging in statesmanship or representation. All that might be left is to hold the players within the system accountable. However, the American people have failed miserably at that as well. So we're going to start on page 45 now with the section heading, The Death of Equality Under the Law. Not only have the constitutional protections against power consolidation been undermined and de facto rejected, but the assumption of equality under the law required for effective constitutionalism has evaporated. Not only have Americans come to expect some groups to be treated more harshly under the law than other groups, but we don't expect our government officials to be held to the same standard of law at all. So I've been wondering where to put this because I think it's important, but I don't want people to stop reading at this point or listening. Because remember, the heading here is the death of equality under the law. So now this is being recorded in 2024, and former President Donald Trump is being targeted on several fronts in court. And as this is going on, there are a lot of people who claim this unprecedented targeting of a former president of the United States proves what? That no one is above the law, when there is actually nothing further from the truth. Indeed, it indicates the very opposite of that assertion. It actually proves that there are a lot of people above and outside the law. And this targeting of political opponents is exactly what one would expect to see in a true democracy. Trump can be targeted because he lost the election. His ideas have no right to exist, and in fact, he must be punished for not falling into line with the narrative approved by the sovereign. And I know there's a lot of comparisons between the different protests that have happened over the past few years, but the targeting of January 6th protesters and trespassers, while the mostly peaceful protesters of 2020 who burned down entire city blocks and killed police officers and shopkeepers, and they were released without bond, or actually had Congress people fund their bonds, this is not a story of hypocrisy. It is what should be expected in a democracy where if you don't agree with what the supposed majority wants you to believe, your opinion has no right to exist. You have no rights. You have no freedom of speech. You have no right to protest. You have no right to hold or share an opinion or even debate any issue if you are on the losing side. However, if you're parroting or promulgating the message, the very message that those in power want you to tell, that want you to adopt and want you to promote, there's absolutely nothing you cannot get away with. And I mean, I know we are a large country with a lot of smaller governments, and so maybe it's not a fair comparison where, January 6th protesters were in the only national city in the country, and those other protests in 2020 took place in many, many cities, and so it wasn't the same everywhere. But believe it or not, the protests in 2020 were very destructive in DC too. And no, they were not held accountable. I mean, even simple trespass cases regarding the Capitol building outside the happenings of January 6th have been handled very differently depending on the politics and opinions of the perpetrators. So all the targeting of Donald Trump reveals is that we live in a country now where those in power will attempt to use fear to prevent an alternate message or opinion from gaining any traction. If they can do this to Trump, a former president and a very wealthy individual, everyone who is watching has got to be thinking that not only could they, this ordinary person, they could never afford to be targeted in a similar way. I mean, anything close to what they're doing to Trump would utterly destroy an ordinary citizen. But if they're willing to do this to a person who was at one point the most powerful man in the world, why wouldn't they be willing to come after a nobody like me who holds what might be an unpopular opinion? And it serves as another example, not of how nobody is above the law, but an example of the opposite, of how anyone can be above the law if they hold the correct position, the position those in power want them to hold. And thus, if you're tracking here, it's another evidence that equality under the law is dead. Take the case of Hillary Clinton. In 2016, the FBI was looking into whether classified information was improperly stored or transmitted on Clinton's personal system in violation of the federal statute that makes it a felony to mishandle classified information either intentionally or in a grossly negligent way, or a second statute making it a misdemeanor to knowingly remove classified information from appropriate systems or storage facilities. They were also looking into additional national security concerns and investigating whether there was evidence of computer intrusion by nation states or by hostile actors of any kind. Okay, so I am actually taking all of this from the Huffington Post. It's an article called "Evidence Hillary Clinton Broke Federal Laws and Jeopardized National Security, No Charges," from July of 2016. They found evidence that Secretary Clinton was, quote, extremely careless in her handling of very sensitive, highly classified information, end quote. They also assessed, quote, that hostile actors gained access to the private commercial email accounts of people with whom Secretary Clinton was in regular contact from her personal account, end quote. In addition, the FBI assessed, quote, that Secretary Clinton's personal email domain was both known by a large number of people and readily apparent. She also used her personal email extensively while outside the United States, including sending and receiving work-related emails in the territory of sophisticated adversaries. Given that combination of factors, we assess it is possible hostile actors gained access to Secretary Clinton's personal email account, end quote. Essentially, Then FBI Director James Comey laid out the case to prosecute under the Federal Espionage Act, 18 U.S. Code paragraph 793, as he clearly outlined proof of gross negligence and then said they would not prosecute. In addition, Comey let it be known this decision to not prosecute was only applicable to Senator/Secretary Clinton. Quote, to be clear, this is not to suggest that in similar circumstances, a person who engaged in this activity would face no consequences. To the contrary, those individuals are often subject to security or administrative sanctions, but that's not what we're deciding now. End quote. So even though the evidence was there that she broke the law, they would not prosecute. However, if someone else broke the same law in the same way, they might prosecute. I bet it had everything to do with what their politics were, what their opinions were, and if they were on the right team. But every outlet covering this story came to the same conclusion. The rule of law in the United States applying equally to all its citizenry is a bedrock principle of our republic. And the case of Hillary Clinton in 2016 unequivocally demonstrated that equality under the law has been abandoned, as it revealed there are clearly some people outside the reach of any law. We have to stop here for time, but I hope you can see, one, how the targeting of one powerful person does not mean no one is above the law. And two, how dangerous this spreading idea of democracy truly is.